Let's say you're a landlord and you have a tenant who's a bit of a hassle to deal with. They hardly pay rent and are now behind by 3 months. You have heard some people say they deal with those sort of tenants by simply throwing out their belongings and locking them out. Should you do the same? Or there's a friend to whom you lent money, but they are struggling to pay you back. You owe them twice as much, and upon paying the loan back, you think it would be a good idea to just give them back the difference. But is this a good idea? The premise of our conversation on First Issues this evening is to establish whether these measures to deal with debtors are legal, and if not, what the legal process to follow looks like. We have engaged attorney at Law Bonolo Selelo to help us unpack what the law says about some of these common scenarios around debt and how you can protect yourself as both a creditor and a debtor.
When we deal with issues of rent, right, we don't usually categorize them as debt collection. And the reason why that is because issues of rent have their own special type of law. So, for example, if I always tell my clients that own properties for rental to say to them, do not let it get past 2 months, right? Because trying to recover those 2+ months is just going to cause a lot of problems. Because sometimes when a person can't pay rent, it usually indicates that they have other debts that they're not able to service. So when a person isn't paying their rent, you have to actually go to court to evict them. You can't just lock the door and throw them out with their things, right? And when you go to court to evict them, in addition to that eviction, you would be asking the court to give you an order for the rent that is outstanding or any thing that is called holding over. And holding over is where a person continues to stay in the property, but they're not paying rent and you've had the lease cancelled, either because you've written to them in terms of the lease agreement or you've gone to court. And that's the reason why we tend not to categorize it as debt collection. But once you have your order, let's say the rent is 6,000 that hasn't been paid or holding over or whatever you call it, is 6,000 bula, then the collection of that money is similar to any other debt collection process.
So I want us to talk about the scenarios that are given you. Are they legal? So in the case of a landlord locking out that tenant, or a friend giving me money that is shorter than what I'd given them because I owe them. Are any of those things legal?
The first one, where the landlord just locks the house, is not legal. The law does not like people who do things without following the proper process. So what the landlord has to do is they have to go to court and get an eviction order to get the tenant out. If the landlord just locks the door, and maybe they lock the door and take the tenant's stuff and throws them outside, you don't know the extent of the damage that you're causing. And the tenant can actually sue you, right? Can sue you for you to be able to open that house, for them to get back inside, for you to follow the right process. And they can also sue you for the damage that has been caused to their properties. And the reason why that is because you never know what this person keeps in the house. What if you're locking and their medication is inside, right? And they can't get a hold of you, and now they have to go to hospital. They incur all these other additional debts that you didn't think about when you locked the door. So the law does not like that. It's called a rule against self-help. And then in relation to where you lend your friend 2,000 bula and you owe them 500 from a different thing, the law does allow that, because even if you go to court to try and recover that 2,000, they're entitled to counterclaim for the 500 and offset and say, yeah, I owed you 2,000, but you owe me 500, so I'm going to offset.
I want us to talk about some other various scenarios where there are issues of debt involved. So somebody owes somebody money. What legal processes are there to follow that you need to be aware of if you want to collect your money?
I think the first thing to be aware of is that the amount of money involved in the debt is the one that will tell you which court to go to. right? So, for example, if the debt is 30,000 pula or less, you can go to the small claims court. And you can only go to the small claims court if you are a natural person, not a company or anything like that, right? And then if it's more than 30,000 up to, I think it's about 100,000, you can go to the magistrate's court. And then above that, you can go to the high court to recover the debt. So I usually tell people this, but a lot of times people are like, Bonolo, you're being too much of a lawyer. I say, if you're going to borrow somebody money or lend somebody money, make sure there's something that you have that can prove that you've lent this person money. And I'll give you an example. I'll say to you, Bonantaro, please borrow me 2,000 pula. I'll say it to your face. And you're like, Bonolo, you're my friend. Yeah, sure. You go to the ATM, you withdraw to 2,000 pula, and then you give it directly into my hand, right? Tomorrow you send me a message and say, hey, Bonolo, I really need that 2,000 pula and you've passed our deadline. Please pay me. And I send a message back and I say, what 2,000? Right? Yeah. Because there's nothing that shows you've actually given me any money. So when we get to court, I'll say the same thing. I say, but that's all. Has never given me anything. So it's difficult to prove. So if it's small amounts of money, yes, you might not have like a formal agreement, right? But also small amounts of money depends on who you are. If you cannot put it in the form of an agreement, at least have some sort of transaction that can be followed, where you e-wallet me the money instead of giving it as cash, where you send me a message and say, hey, Bonolo, I've e-walleted you 2,000 pula, kana orilo tamusa within 6 months, which is around May or so, such that you can then say, here are the messages, right? So when you try to recover the debt and the person isn't paying back, you start the process by way of summons at court. And when it's a straightforward matter where Bonolo is not even bothering to deny, you will get what is called default judgment, which is effectively a judgment that says Bonolo owes you 2,000 pula. And if you haven't agreed on interest, it will just be simple interest, which is about 10% per annum, right? And then you engage a deputy sheriff. And you engage this deputy sheriff after you get what is called a writ of execution. That writ is the one that says to the deputy sheriff, go to Bonolo and say to her, Bonolo, there's this judgment that says you owe Bonataro X amount of money. Give me the money. If Bonolo doesn't have the money, the deputy sheriff will search for Bonolo's assets. So if the deputy sheriff is in the house and maybe I have a car, he can attach that car. Or my sofas, or my fridge, I think. The only thing I think they can't attach is the bed and my clothes, right? And they attach this in order to go and sell it by public auction to recover the money that I owe you. If I have no assets, then he gives out what is called a nala bona return. And that is the document I use now to try and get someone thrown in jail because they can't pay a debt. Yes. And unfortunately, a lot of people believe that if you've been to jail for a debt, then that debt is erased. That's not what happens. You can go to jail as many times as is necessary until you pay off that amount of money. But at some point in time, a judge will have to say, if you've been to jail 6 times, clearly this person doesn't have money.
You've just been speaking about jail for someone who's a debtor, who owes the money, right? Yes. But what of the person who's trying to collect the debt? Yes. What legal ramifications are there for them should they not follow proper legal procedure?
It depends on the extent of the lack of following of proper legal procedure. And I'll give you an example of maybe they've gotten default judgment, but this person can't be found anyway. And they happen to see that person passing by in front of them and they attack them and, take their car keys and stuff like that. You see, once they take possession of those car keys, they're creating a problem because this debtor can actually go to court to sue for the return of that car and any damages associated with taking that car forcibly from them. And they can even claim there were so many other things inside the car that you have taken because you didn't follow the right process. And to add on to that, right now, deputy sheriffs already have a problem when they're doing their jobs and following the right process. And now imagine when you are just there taking the law into your own hands. You don't have the protections that a deputy sheriff would have because you would just be doing things not in line with the law.
But then again, one may need to understand why, in spite of there being all of these legal processes and procedures, we're still seeing a proliferation of people, landlords throwing people out or locking them out, friends offsetting debt illegally, taking matters into their own hands. Why are we seeing that as far as, you dealing with these things legally when they come to you?
So when we talk about taking the law into your own hands, we don't include offsetting. Because if you come to me as a client with that situation, I will tell you, we need to settle this because it's not necessary for us to go to court because you each owe each other. So offset is something that is recognized even without going to the courts for it, right?
Okay.
But the throwing of people out of the house because they owe rent without an eviction order, or like taking people's property to try and go and sell for yourself or to keep it, that's the one that is not allowed in terms of the law. And I think the reason why we seem to see a lot of that, I don't think it's more of a legal thing, but I think it's more of an economic thing. I think we have a problem with debt from what I have seen in Botswana, such that what we actually get as an income and what we actually spend, right, does not tally for purposes of us staying above water.
We have come to the end of this week's installment of First Issues. Thank you so much for your viewership, and we hope that you have picked a nugget or two of new knowledge. With that, we wish you a happy and safe May Day break. Good night.
This program was brought to you in association with First National Bank of Botswana.